The shimmer of heat rose from the cracked asphalt of Miller's fuel stop, distorting the horizon where 3 highways met at Riverside Junction. 7-year-old Rachel Connor stood beside the dusty pickup truck, her small hand resting protectively on the muscular shoulder of Max, her German shepherd. The dog's ears suddenly pricked forward, his posture shifting from relaxed to vigilant in an instant. Before Rachel could register the change, the distant rumble of motorcycles shattered the quiet afternoon. Frank Miller, wiping his weathered hands on a faded rag, emerged from the gas station's convenience store, his expression darkening as the sound grew louder. "Rachel, honey, why don't you come inside while your daddy finishes up?" He called, but his words were drowned by the thunderous arrival of 6 motorcycles, chrome gleaming under the merciless Texas sun. The riders circled the pumps like vultures, their leather vests bearing the crimson-eyed serpent patch of the Iron Serpents. And their leader, a mountain of a man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, dismounted first. Jackson Chains Blackwood surveyed the station before his eyes landed on Rachel. The smile that spread across his face held no warmth as he approached, boots scraping deliberately against the concrete. "Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, looming over Rachel. "Cute kid, cuter dog." His hand reached toward Rachel's head, but before his fingers could make contact, Max transformed. The seemingly docile shepherd shifted with military precision, placing himself between Rachel and the threat, his teeth bared in a silent warning that froze Chains mid-motion. The low, rumbling growl that emanated from the dog's chest carried the unmistakable promise of violence, stopping the hardened biker in his tracks. "Your mutt's got an attitude problem," Chains snarled, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. But in Max's unwavering stance and Rachel's fearless gaze, something gave him pause. What the biker couldn't know was that the German shepherd standing between him and the little girl had survived 3 combat tours in Afghanistan that had been trained to detect explosives, take down armed insurgents, and protect his handler at all costs. And right now, that protective instinct was focused entirely on the small, silent child who stood without flinching in the shadow of danger. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Rachel Connor hadn't always been so quiet. Before last year's accident, she'd been a chatterbox, filling rooms with stories and questions that tumbled out faster than answers could follow. Now, at 7 years old, she spoke only when necessary, and sometimes not even then. The doctors called it selective mutism, triggered by the trauma of losing her mother in the head-on collision that had left Rachel physically unharmed but emotionally shattered. Only with Max did the words flow freely, whispered into his attentive ears during their nightly ritual when she would read him stories, her small fingers tracing the words on pages as her voice grew stronger in the safety of his presence. When the world grew too loud or frightening, Rachel retreated into silence, but Max always seemed to understand what she couldn't say, responding to the smallest changes in her breathing or posture as if she were speaking clearly. In Max, Rachel had found not just protection, but a bridge back to her voice. Thomas Connor watched his daughter through the window of Miller's convenience store, his hand instinctively touching the faded scar that ran along his jawline, a souvenir from his second tour in Afghanistan. After 15 years as a Marine, including 3 combat tours that had left him with a chest full of medals and a mind full of nightmares, Thomas had returned home only to lose his wife 9 months later. Now he carried his grief like his service weapon, close, heavy, and always ready. He'd moved Rachel to Riverside Junction seeking anonymity and peace, starting a small security consulting business that barely paid the bills but gave him purpose. Thomas had rescued Max from a military dog retirement facility where the wounded shepherd had been deemed too traumatized for adoption after his handler was killed by an IED. Something in the dog's wary eyes had mirrored Thomas's own, and in that recognition, a bond had formed that extended beyond handler and service animal. They were 2 warriors helping each other navigate civilian life while jointly protecting the person they both loved most. Max had been the best of his class in the military working dog program with an exceptional record in explosive detection and patrol duties. His file contained commendations for saving his unit multiple times, including once when he'd detected a buried IED seconds before his patrol would have triggered it. But the ambush that killed his handler had left Max with both physical and psychological scars, including a hip injury that occasionally caused him to limp and a deep awareness of sudden movements. The military veterinarians had labeled him unsuitable for reassignment, until Thomas Connor had appeared at the facility, recognized a kindred spirit, and insisted on taking Max home. The connection between Max and Rachel had been immediate and profound. The child who couldn't speak and the dog who understood silence. Max now served dual purposes. He was Thomas's registered PTSD service animal, trained to recognize and interrupt anxiety attacks, and Rachel's emotional support companion, a constant presence who kept nightmares at bay and made the world feel safe again. In their broken family, Max was both guardian and glue. The tension at Miller's fuel stop crystallized in the space between Max's bared teeth and Chain's tattooed hand. Rachel stood perfectly still, her small fingers buried in Max's fur, not in fear but in restraint, a silent command the dog recognized. Frank Miller had emerged fully from the store now, his shotgun visible but not raised, while the other bikers circled their machines restlessly like sharks scenting blood. Max maintained his protective stance, his training evident in how he positioned himself, not attacking but ready to if the threat persisted. The standoff might have escalated further if not for the arrival of Thomas Connor's pickup, which pulled in with a spray of gravel. Thomas assessed the situation in seconds, his military training kicking in as he exited the vehicle with measured calm that belied the storm in his eyes. "Rachel," he called, his voice even. "Max, hold." Both child and dog remained perfectly still as Thomas approached, placing himself alongside his daughter and her protector. Frank Miller nodded almost imperceptibly from the doorway, his own stance relaxing slightly at Thomas's arrival but his grip on the shotgun remaining firm. "Seems your dog doesn't like friendly conversation," Chains commented, taking a deliberate step back while maintaining eye contact with Thomas. There was calculation in his gaze now, measuring the newcomer. "Max is very friendly," Thomas replied coolly. "To friendly people." He placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, feeling her small frame steady beneath his touch. "Everything okay here, Frank?" The gas station owner cleared his throat. "Just explaining to these gentlemen that we're closing up for the evening." Chains laughed, the sound echoing across the empty parking lot. "Kind of early, ain't it? Sun's still high." His eyes narrowed as he studied Thomas more carefully, recognition dawning. "You're that security consultant. The Marine." It wasn't a question. "Heard you moved to our little corner of nowhere. Didn't realize you brought a military mutt with you." "My daughter's dog," Thomas corrected mildly. "And we're just getting gas, same as anyone." One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, knocked over a display of windshield washer fluid. The containers clattered across the pavement, blue liquid spreading like spilled blood across the hot concrete. "Oops," he called out with mock concern. Thomas didn't react to the provocation, but Max's ears flattened slightly, his focus shifting momentarily to track the new movement before returning to Chains. "See, here's the thing," Chains continued, his voice taking on an instructional tone. "Riverside Junction has certain ways of doing business, certain understandings. Frank here is still learning about those understandings." He gestured broadly at the station. "Protection costs money, but it's worth it. Yeah, or some. Because accidents," he nodded toward the spilled fluid, "happen all the time." Throughout this exchange, Rachel hadn't moved or spoken, but her eyes never left Chain's face. There was something in her steady gaze that seemed to unsettle the biker leader, causing him to shift his weight almost imperceptibly. News of the standoff at Miller's fuel stop spread through Riverside Junction before the dust from the Iron Serpent's departure had settled. By dusk, 3 different versions of the story were circulating, each more dramatic than the last. In Mabel's diner, they talked about how little Rachel Connor had stared down Chain's Blackwood without blinking. At the hardware store, Pete Wilson described the military dog that had nearly torn out a biker's throat. By morning, the story had morphed into the little girl and her wolf who had defied the most notorious biker gang in 3 counties. Thomas heard snippets of these embellishments as he went about his business the following day, setting up security cameras for James Washington's auto shop. "They're back, you know," James said quietly as he handed Thomas a wrench. "Circling the town like vultures. Drove past the elementary school this morning, real slow-like." Thomas tightened the mounting bracket with more force than necessary. "They're establishing presence, testing boundaries. Pete says they've been pressuring businesses for protection money for months now. Most folks were paying up just to avoid trouble." James wiped his greasy hands on a rag. Nobody much wanted to be the first to say no. By afternoon, Thomas had seen 4 different Iron Serpents motorcycles cruising Riverside Junction's small grid of streets. They made no attempt to hide their surveillance, their message clear in every revved engine and lingering stare. Thomas recognized the tactics from his deployments, the same methods insurgents used to control villages through fear rather than direct violence. He kept Rachel home from school, setting her up with books and drawing supplies within sight of his workbench where he methodically cleaned Max's training equipment. Around 4:00, the sound of sirens broke the uneasy quiet. Deputy Kate Wilson's patrol car sped past their small rental house, heading toward Main Street. Thomas's phone rang moments later. Frank Miller's voice was tight with controlled alarm. "They broke Pete's arm," he said without preamble. 2 of them walked into the hardware store and smashed his register. When he tried to stop them, they made an example of him. Said it was a message for anyone thinking about playing hero. 335 words. While Rachel slept that night, curled against Max's protective form, Thomas sat on the porch cleaning his service pistol, a habit that calmed his thoughts. The day's events played through his mind, but it was the look in Chain's eyes when he'd first seen Rachel that troubled Thomas most. There had been the expected intimidation and anger, yes, but something else too, a flash of recognition or confusion that didn't fit. Across town, in the abandoned warehouse that served as the Iron Serpent's temporary headquarters, Chain's Blackwood sat alone in his makeshift office. A bottle of whiskey open but barely touched on the scarred desk before him. From his wallet, he withdrew a worn photograph, creased and faded from years of handling. The image showed a much younger Chains, perhaps 14, with his arm around a small girl of about 6. Both children had the same distinctive gray-blue eyes, though the girl's face held a brightness that his had already lost by then. "Hey, boss," Butcher's gravelly voice preceded his hulking form through the doorway. "Boys want to know the plan for tomorrow. That security guy and his kid gonna be a problem." Chains quickly slipped the photo back into his wallet. "We stick to the usual approach. Nobody plays tough guy once their windows get broken or their cars get torched." But his voice lacked its usual conviction. "And the kid? The one with the attack dog?" Chains stared at his lieutenant for a long moment. "Leave him for now. We focus on the businesses first." He reached for the whiskey, effectively dismissing Butcher, who retreated with a puzzled frown. Alone again, Chains extracted the photo once more, studying the little girl's face, his sister, taken to a different foster home when their mother went to prison. He'd searched for years, following cold trails across 3 states only to lose track of her completely after she turned 18. Something about Rachel Connor's eyes had stirred memories. He'd spent a lifetime drowning in alcohol and violence. It was probably nothing, just his mind playing tricks. But as he prepared for bed, the little girl's fearless stare continued to haunt him. "I don't see why we should all suffer because of them," Martha Simmons declared, her voice carrying across the aisle of the grocery store where Thomas was carefully selecting apples under Rachel's watchful eye. "That little girl and her father brought this trouble to our doorstep." She made no attempt to lower her voice, clearly intending for Thomas to hear. Max, wearing his service dog vest, shifted closer to Rachel, who had gone completely still at the woman's words. Thomas maintained his composure, placing another apple in their basket with deliberate calm. Martha, Bob Jenkins, the store owner, cautioned quietly. "No, I'm saying what everyone's thinking," Martha continued, her shopping cart blocking the narrow aisle. "Pete Wilson's in the hospital with a broken arm. The pharmacy got its window smashed last night. And it all started after the confrontation at Miller's. She fixed Thomas with an accusatory stare. Maybe if you and your dog hadn't provoked those bikers, they'd have moved on by now. Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded his worst episodes. He focused on his breathing, on the weight of the apple in his hand, on Rachel's small presence beside him. Before he could formulate a response that wouldn't escalate the situation, Principal Davis from Rachel's elementary school approached, her expression a careful neutral. "Mr. Connor," she said formally, "I was hoping to catch you. Given the current tensions in town, we think it might be best if Rachel stays home for a few days. For her safety, of course." The principal's eyes darted nervously to Max, then back to Thomas. "Some parents have expressed concerns about having a military dog on school grounds, especially with these biker troubles." Thomas felt Rachel's hand slip into his, squeezing tight. "Max is a registered service animal," he said evenly, "and Rachel needs him, especially now." "Of course, but these are unusual circumstances," Principal Davis persisted. "We have to consider all our students." Martha Simmons nodded emphatically. "See, this is exactly what I mean. Those of us who've lived in Riverside Junction all our lives are having our whole town turned upside down because of newcomers who don't understand how things work here." Thomas glanced down at Rachel, saw the hurt and confusion in her eyes, and made a decision. He set down the shopping basket and took his daughter's hand. "Let's go home, sweetie." As they walked away, he heard Martha's triumphant whisper, "Good riddance." That evening, a knock at their door revealed Frank Miller, hat in hand and concern etched on his weathered face. "Heard about what happened at Jenkins' place," he said without preamble. "That ain't right. Martha Simmons never had a kind word for anyone even before all this." He handed Thomas a flyer. "Town meeting tomorrow night. Thought you should know." "No." Thomas studied the paper. "Not sure we'd be welcome." Frank snorted. "It's about your expertise, son. I was in Korea, and I recognize what these iron serpents are doing. It's the same playbook: divide the community, isolate the strong ones, pick off the weak. But these folks haven't seen what you and I have seen." He glanced at Rachel, who was sitting with Max on the living room floor, drawing quietly. "You don't have to come, but this town needs to understand what it's up against." The community center was packed when Thomas reluctantly arrived the next evening, Rachel and Max at his side. The conversations hushed momentarily as they entered, then resumed with increased intensity. Deputy Kate Wilson nodded to them from near the podium where Mayor Harrison was attempting to bring the meeting to order. Martha Simmons sat in the front row, her disapproving glare following them as they found seats near the back. "We all know why we're here," the mayor began. "The iron serpents have escalated from intimidation to violence, and we need to decide how to respond as a community." "We should just pay them," someone called out. "It's cheaper than replacing broken windows every week." "And then what?" Frank Miller stood up. "They'll just demand more next time. That's how extortion works." "Easy for you to say," Martha interjected. "Your gas station hasn't been touched." "Not yet," Frank replied grimly. The debate grew heated, with voices rising in argument across the room. Rachel pressed closer to Max, who remained alert but calm at her feet. When the shouting reached a peak, Thomas finally rose, his military bearing commanding attention even before he spoke. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice cutting through the clamor. "In Afghanistan, insurgents would target villages using the exact same methods: intimidation, selective violence, creating division among the people." He scanned the room, meeting hostile and curious gazes alike. "They're counting on you to turn against each other, to isolate anyone who resists. That's how they win without a fight." "So what, we're supposed to form some kind of militia?" Mayor Harrison asked skeptically. "These people are dangerous criminals." "No," Thomas shook his head, "but you need a coordinated response. Communication, mutual support systems, ways to protect the most vulnerable first." He explained the patterns he'd observed, the careful escalation of threats designed to maximize fear with minimal actual violence. As he spoke, Rachel suddenly stiffened beside him, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Thomas recognized the signs of an impending panic attack, but before he could react, Max quietly rose from his position, pressing his body against Rachel's legs and placing his head in her lap. The dog's warm weight and steady presence immediately began calming her, but his trained response to her anxiety so smooth and natural that most people in the room didn't even notice what was happening. But Deputy Wilson did, as did Frank and a few others who were watching closely. The seamless way the dog anticipated and addressed Rachel's needs spoke volumes about his training and their bond. 400 words. After the meeting had wound down, with the town still divided but at least discussing actual solutions, Pete Wilson approached Thomas, his arm in a cast and his face drawn with pain. Rachel, who had been silently observing everything from Thomas's side, suddenly reached into her small backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Without a word, she handed it to Pete. The hardware store owner carefully unfolded the drawing with his good hand. On it, Rachel had depicted Pete standing in front of his store, his arm healed, surrounded by townspeople who formed a protective circle around him. Max was drawn in the foreground, alert and watchful. "Well now," Pete said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "That's something, isn't it?" He knelt down to Rachel's level. "Thank you, little lady. I think I needed to see this today." This small interaction didn't go unnoticed. Several people, including Deputy Wilson and Dr. Sarah Chin from the local clinic, gathered around to see the drawing. The simple, hopeful image somehow conveyed what Thomas's words alone couldn't: a vision of the community standing together rather than fracturing apart. "Mr. Connor," Deputy Wilson said as people began to disperse, "I'd like to hear more about those coordination strategies you mentioned. County resources are stretched thin, but if we organize the town properly." She glanced at Rachel and Max, then back to Thomas. "We've got more strength here than most people realize." Thomas nodded, feeling a cautious optimism for the first time since the confrontation at the gas station. "It starts with communication networks, buddy systems for businesses, designated safe houses." He outlined the basics of what they would need, drawing on his military experience while adapting it for civilian application. By the time they left the community center, a core group had formed around Thomas, Frank, Deputy Wilson, and Dr. Chin, people committed to organizing Riverside Junction's defense. As they walked home under the Texas stars, Rachel slipped her small hand into her father's. "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" she asked softly, one of the rare times she had spoken outside their home since the accident. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, sweetheart. I think we are." Max walked beside them, his posture relaxed but vigilant, the very picture of the guardian he had been trained to be. Over the next 3 days, Riverside Junction underwent a transformation. Thomas Connor's living room became an impromptu command center, with maps of the town spread across the coffee table and lists of volunteers taped to the walls. Drawing on his military experience, Thomas organized the town into sectors, each with its own coordinator responsible for observation and communication. Frank Miller, despite his age, took charge of the Central Business District, distributing two-way radio salvage from his Korean War collection. Dr. Chin turned her clinic into a safe house, stocking extra medical supplies and creating a rotating schedule of volunteers to ensure it was never left unattended. Deputy Wilson, working within the constraints of her official capacity, coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions for additional patrol support, while discreetly sharing information with Thomas's civilian network. Max became an unexpected centerpiece of their defense strategy. Thomas conducted a crash course in canine behavior for interested townspeople, explaining how to read a dog's alerts and what commands would be recognized by service animals like Max. Inspired by this, James Washington and 3 other local dog owners began training their own pets in basic protection techniques. Though these family pets couldn't match Max's military training, they added another layer of security, particularly for identifying approaching motorcycles before they were visible. Within 72 hours, Riverside Junction had developed an early warning system that would have impressed Thomas's former commanding officers. The school board, after heated debate, reversed its decision about Rachel staying home. Instead, Principal Davis requested that Max be allowed to accompany Rachel to school each day. The German Shepherd quickly became a beloved fixture in Rachel's second-grade classroom, where teacher Linda Morgan incorporated him into lessons about responsibility and service. Rachel began to speak more frequently in Max's presence, first just to explain his training to curious classmates, then gradually participating in class discussions. The other children who struggled with anxiety were drawn to the calming presence of the dog, creating an unexpected therapeutic benefit that spread throughout the school. When 3 Iron Serpent motorcycles were spotted circling the playground during recess, Max's alert posture warned the teachers before the bikers came into view, allowing them to smoothly transition the children indoors without panic. This successful implementation of Thomas's protocols reinforced the community's growing confidence in their ability to protect their most vulnerable members. Frank Miller watched Thomas and Rachel from the window of his gas station, guilt gnawing at him like an old toothache. The burner phone in his pocket felt heavy, a constant reminder of his betrayal. He hadn't wanted to cooperate with the Iron Serpents, hadn't planned on becoming their informant, but they'd left him little choice after showing him the photos of his son Bobby in prison, explaining in graphic detail what would happen if word didn't get back to them about the town's defense plans. So Frank found himself in an impossible position, feeding Chain's information about security cameras and patrol schedules while working alongside the very people whose trust he was betraying. Rachel often sat at the small table in the corner of the convenience store while Thomas installed additional security measures. The quiet child would draw for hours, occasionally looking up to watch Frank with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. Today she was working intently on a new picture, her crayon moving with deliberate strokes as Max dozed at her feet. When Frank's burner phone vibrated, he slipped into the storage room to answer it. "They're setting up a new camera on the roof tomorrow," he whispered, keeping his voice low. "Covers the south approach and the school route. Wilson's got 2 volunteers patrolling Main Street at night now, rotating shifts." Each word tasted bitter in his mouth. "Good," Chains responded. "Keep it coming. Remember what happens if you don't." After hanging up, Frank returned to find Rachel watching him, her drawing complete. She silently turned the paper toward him. Frank's blood ran cold. The child had drawn a remarkably accurate scene of a man who looked like him talking to a shadowy figure with a snake on his jacket. In the background was a prison building with a stick figure inside. Frank's hands trembled as he took the drawing. "You heard?" he asked hoarsely. Rachel didn't answer, but her eyes held no judgment, only a sadness that seemed far too ancient for her 7 years. Frank crumpled the drawing and shoved it into his pocket, glancing nervously toward the garage where Thomas was working. "My boy's in trouble," Frank said finally, the confession spilling out unexpectedly. "They'll hurt him if I don't help them. You understand about protecting family, don't you?" He hadn't meant to justify himself to a child, but something in Rachel's steady gaze demanded honesty. Rachel reached into her backpack and pulled out another drawing, this one showing Frank standing with Thomas, Deputy Wilson, and other townspeople. In the picture, they were surrounding a younger man who must have been Frank's son, protecting him. The message was clear even to Frank's troubled mind. There was another way if only he would trust his neighbors as they had trusted him. "It's not that simple," Frank muttered, though the seed of doubt had been planted. As Rachel continued her silent observation, Frank found himself wondering if there might indeed be a solution he hadn't considered, one that wouldn't require betraying the town that had become his home over the past 45 years. The Iron Serpent's intimidation campaign intensified as Riverside Junction's defenses solidified. Dr. Chen arrived at her clinic one morning to find the windows shattered and threatening messages spray-painted across the walls. The pharmacy's delivery van had its tires slashed after the owner installed the security cameras Thomas recommended. Most disturbing was the nighttime attack on the elementary school, where classroom windows were broken and desks overturned, and a clear escalation targeting the children that crossed a line for even the most hesitant townspeople. The town's response, however, was not what the bikers expected. Instead of fracturing under pressure, Riverside Junction united. When Dr. Chen arrived to find her clinic vandalized, she also found James Washington and his crew already boarding up the windows. Mrs. Rodriguez from the bakery had brought coffee and pastries. By noon, volunteers had repainted the walls and installed stronger security measures. Similar scenes played out at each targeted location, community members appearing within minutes of an incident, working together to repair damage and strengthen defenses. Yet despite these external successes, Thomas found himself struggling with increasing doubt. The pressure of responsibility weighed heavily on him as he lay awake each night, listening for the sound of motorcycles. His PTSD symptoms, which had been improving since moving to Riverside Junction, returned with renewed intensity, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and the crushing guilt that he had somehow brought the war home with him, endangering not just his daughter but an entire town. Rachel found him during one of these episodes, sitting on the kitchen floor at 3 in the morning, back pressed against the refrigerator as sweat beaded on his forehead. Without a word, she disappeared and returned with Max, who immediately pressed his weight against Thomas's side, the trained response that helped ground him during flashbacks. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor opposite her father, simply waiting as Max's steady presence slowly brought Thomas back to the present. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Thomas whispered when he could finally speak. "You shouldn't have to see this." Rachel reached for his hand, her small fingers interlacing with his much larger ones. "Max helps you like he helps me," she said softly. "That's why we're a family." The simple observation caught Thomas off guard. In all his strategic planning and organization, he had somehow forgotten the most important defense. They had not the cameras or the patrols, but this unbreakable bond between a wounded warrior, a traumatized child, and the dog who bridged their broken places. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Rachel asked, echoing her question from after the town meeting. Thomas pulled his daughter close, feeling Max shift to accommodate them both within his protective circle. "Yes," he answered, with more conviction than before. "We're going to be okay because we have each other. And that's something the Iron Serpents don't have." As if understanding his words, Max rested his head on Thomas's knee, his intelligent eyes moving between father and daughter. In that moment, Thomas realized that what had started as a security operation had become something far more significant, a community rediscovering its strength through connection rather than isolation. Whatever Chains and his gang had planned next, they would face not just a collection of defensive measures, but a town that had remembered how to be a family. The morning dawned with an unusual stillness over Riverside Junction, the kind of heavy quiet that Thomas recognized from his military days, the calm before an ambush. Dr. Chen had called him to the clinic at first light to consult on a new security system, leaving Rachel with Frank at the gas station, a routine they'd established over the past week. Max had been reluctant to leave Rachel, pressing his body against her legs and whining softly, but Thomas had assured him they wouldn't be gone long. Now, as Thomas helped Dr. Chen adjust the motion sensors on her back door, he found himself checking his watch repeatedly, an uneasiness growing in his gut. At the gas station, Rachel sat at her usual table, drawing quietly while Frank restocked the cooler. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the soda cans, his mind distracted by the decision weighing on him. His son's situation had worsened. The latest message from Chains included a photo of Bobby with a black eye and split lip, a warning of worse to come. The burner phone in Frank's pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. When it vibrated, he stepped into the storage room, his heart pounding. "Time's up, old man," Chain's voice rasped through the speaker. "We're coming today. Either you leave the back door unlocked and keep your mouth shut, or your boy doesn't make it to his parole hearing. Simple as that." "The kid's here," Frank whispered, glancing through the crack in the door at Rachel. "Connor's daughter. She's not supposed to be part of this." There was a pause on the other end. "Not my problem. Keep her out of the way and she won't get hurt. This ends today." The line went dead. Frank leaned against the shelves, his legs suddenly weak. Through the door, he could see Rachel watching him, her eyes knowing beyond her years. She'd been drawing again, this time a picture of Frank talking on the phone, his face sad and scared. The child saw too much, understood too much. Frank made his decision in that moment, reaching for the store phone to call Thomas, but before he could dial, the rumble of motorcycles filled the air. Rachel heard them first, her head lifting at the familiar sound. Max, even from across town at the clinic, also alerted to the distant engines, his ears pricking forward and body tensing. Thomas immediately recognized the dog's reaction and was reaching for his phone when it rang, Deputy Wilson's clipped voice confirming his fears. "Multiple bikes approaching from the south," she reported. "At least 8, moving fast toward the center of town." "Rachel's at the gas station with Frank," Thomas said, already moving toward the door, Max keeping pace beside him. "I'm 3 minutes out," Wilson responded. "Meet you there." Oh. But Thomas knew 3 minutes could be an eternity in a combat situation. He and Max ran the 6 blocks to Miller's fuel stop, the dog outpacing him as they rounded the final corner just in time to see Chains Blackwood and 5 other iron serpents pulling into the station. Through the store windows, Thomas could make out Frank moving protectively toward Rachel, positioning himself between her and the approaching bikers. Thomas reached for his phone to activate the town's alert system, but before he could, he saw Frank step outside to confront Chains. The old man's voice carried across the lot, surprisingly steady. "This isn't right. There's a child here." Chains ignored him, signaling to 2 of his men who pushed past Frank into the store. Thomas heard Rachel's frightened cry. At the same moment, Max bolted forward, covering the distance to the gas station in seconds. The Shepherd crashed through the store's screen door, a blur of focused aggression that took the first biker by surprise, knocking him to the ground. The second man reached for something in his jacket, but Max was faster, clamping down on his wrist with precisely controlled pressure that caused him to howl in pain. Chains turned at the commotion, his expression changing from confidence to shock as he recognized the dog. Outside, Thomas was still running toward the station when he saw Frank make a desperate lunge at Chains, attempting to restrain him. The biker leader reacted instantly, his elbow connecting with Frank's temple and sending the older man crumpling to the concrete. "Get the kid," Chains shouted, and Thomas watched in horror as Butcher, the massive biker with the neck scar, emerged from the store with Rachel struggling in his arms. Max immediately released the biker he'd neutralized and turned toward this new threat, but Chains was ready for him, throwing a heavy chain that caught the dog across the muzzle with a sickening crack. Max staggered but didn't fall, blood streaming from a gash above his eye as he regrouped for another attack. Rachel, seeing her protector hurt, bit down hard on Butcher's hand, causing him to curse but not release her. Chains, recognizing that Thomas was seconds away from reaching them, made a snap decision. "Take her and go, now." He ordered Butcher, who threw Rachel onto his motorcycle and roared away from the station, 2 other bikers falling in behind him. Chains and the remaining iron serpents quickly mounted their bikes to follow, but not before Chains locked eyes with Thomas across the parking lot. In that brief moment, something passed between them, not the triumph Thomas expected to see in his enemy's eyes, but something more complex, almost conflicted. Then they were gone, leaving Thomas standing in the gas station lot with an injured dog, an unconscious Frank, and the most important person in his world taken from him. The sound of Deputy Wilson's siren approached as Max limped to Frank's side, checking on the fallen man before returning to Thomas, awaiting commands despite his own injury. The German Shepherd's eyes held a clear message: they would find Rachel, whatever it took. Thomas Connor had experienced fear in combat, the adrenaline-soaked hyper-awareness that came with bullets flying and IEDs detonating. But nothing in his military career had prepared him for the hollow terror of watching his daughter disappear on the back of a motorcycle. It was Deputy Wilson who kept him functioning, her calm, authoritative voice cutting through his panic as she called in the kidnapping and mobilized every available officer in the county. "We need to think clearly," she insisted, guiding Thomas to sit on the curb outside Miller's fuel stop while Dr. Chen examined the gash above Max's eye. "Tell me everything you know about these men. Any place they might take her." Thomas forced himself to focus, to apply his tactical training to the situation. "They've been operating out of the abandoned Riverside mill," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "About 5 miles north of town. We've had observers tracking their movements." Frank Miller had regained consciousness, a large bruise forming where chains had struck him. His eyes were hollow with guilt as he approached Thomas. "This is my fault," he confessed, words tumbling out in a rush. "They were threatening my son in prison. I've been feeding them information. I tried to call you when I realized they were coming for Rachel," but his voice broke. "I'm so sorry, Thomas." The betrayal should have infuriated Thomas, but he found only a dull recognition. In war, fear made people do desperate things to protect their loved ones. Instead of anger, he felt a strange clarity descending, the familiar combat focus that had saved his life multiple times in Afghanistan. "Did you hear anything about their plans?" he asked Frank. "Anything that might help us find Rachel?" The old man shook his head miserably, then paused. "Wait, Rachel left something. Just before they came in, she was drawing. She hid it under the counter." Thomas rushed inside to find the drawing, a crude but recognizable map of the Riverside area with an X marked near the old water tower, well beyond the mill where they'd thought the Iron Serpents were based. More importantly, Rachel had left her special bracelet, the one with her mother's charm, beside the drawing. Thomas showed it to Max, who sniffed it carefully, memorizing Rachel's scent. By noon, Riverside Junction had mobilized in a way Thomas had never imagined possible. The town's defensive network transformed into a search operation, with James Washington's mechanics blocking roads, Mrs. Rodriguez's bakery becoming a supply station for searchers, and even Martha Simmons opening her home as a coordination center. People who had been suspicious of Thomas days earlier now looked to him for leadership, their community differences forgotten in the face of a child in danger. "They'll expect us to come straight at 'em," Thomas explained to the group gathered in the sheriff's office. "Military tactics 101, never do what your enemy anticipates." He outlined a strategy that utilized the town's communication network to create a distraction at the mill while a smaller team approached the water tower from the riverside. "I'm going with you," Deputy Wilson stated, not a question but a declaration. Dr. Chin also volunteered, bringing medical supplies in case Rachel was injured. As Thomas strapped on a bulletproof vest borrowed from the sheriff's department, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Frank Miller stood there, a determined look replacing his earlier guilt. "My son is in prison because he got mixed up with these people years ago," Frank said quietly. "I won't let another child suffer for my mistakes. I know these woods better than anyone. I can get you there unseen." Thomas studied the old man's face, seeing past the betrayal to the core of someone who, like himself, would do anything to protect family. He nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement of both the offer and the implied apology. Max, his wound cleaned and bandaged by Dr. Chin, stood alert beside Thomas, the dog's entire body focused with singular purpose. Despite his injury, there was no question of leaving him behind. Not only was he their best chance of tracking Rachel, but Thomas knew that nothing short of death would stop the shepherd from searching for his young charge. As they prepared to leave, Thomas found himself falling back on the ritual he'd performed before every combat mission, checking his equipment, reviewing the plan, and finally touching the photo of Rachel he kept in his pocket. But this time the stakes were immeasurably higher. This wasn't a mission for country or duty. This was everything that mattered in his world. 835 words. The old water tower rose above the tree line, its rusted frame silhouetted against the late afternoon sky like a sentinel from another era. From their concealed position in the underbrush, Thomas could make out 3 motorcycles parked at the base of the structure and a flicker of movement in the maintenance shed nearby. Max, despite his injury, remained perfectly still beside him, ears forward and body tense, the posture that told Thomas they were close to Rachel. The distraction at the mill had worked better than anticipated. James Washington and his crew had created enough commotion to draw most of the Iron Serpents away, leaving only a skeleton crew guarding the water tower hideout. Deputy Wilson had positioned herself on the access road with 2 other officers, ready to move in when signaled, while Frank led Thomas, Dr. Chin, and Max through the dense woods that bordered the property. "There," Frank whispered, pointing to the shed. That's where they'd keep her. Used to be the water district office before they automated everything. Thomas nodded, scrutinizing the building for points of entry and potential threats. He could make out Butcher's massive frame through one of the dirty windows and at least one other guard by the door. Of chains there was no sign. Thomas turned to Max, unclipped his leash, and gave the hand signal they'd practiced countless times in Afghanistan, the command to search and protect. The dog slipped silently into the underbrush, circling wide to approach the shed from behind. On my signal, Thomas murmured to Frank and Dr. Chin, but stay back unless I call for you. He had just started to move when a voice behind them caused all three to freeze. Looking for something, Marine? Chain stepped from behind a tree, a pistol held casually at his side. The biker leader was alone, his expression unreadable. Thomas straightened slowly, hands visible. You know why I'm here? Yeah, Chain's acknowledged. Figured find this place eventually. Your kid Smart dropped clues along the way. Reminds me of someone. Something in his tone made Thomas pause. If you heard her, Thomas began, but Chains cut him off. She's fine, scared but not hurt. The biker holstered his pistol, a gesture that confused Thomas. Butcher wanted to use her for leverage, make the town back off. I told him children are off limits. Then why take her at all? Dr. Chin demanded, her medical bag clutched tightly. Chain's eyes remained fixed on Thomas. Needed to end this standoff one way or another. Town's gotten too organized, too resistant. Bad for business. He reached slowly into his vest pocket and withdrew a worn photograph, holding it out to Thomas. Take a look. Tell me what you see. Thomas cautiously accepted the photo, studying the faded image of two children, a teenage boy and a young girl with startlingly familiar eyes. The girl looked so much like. That's my sister, Chain said quietly. But lost track of her when we got separated in foster care. Spent years trying to find her after I aged out of the system. He nodded at Thomas's confusion. Your daughter has her eyes. When I saw Rachel at the gas station, it hit me like a truck. Then I heard her name, Rachel Connor. My sister married a man named Connor. The revelation struck Thomas like a physical blow. Elizabeth, he whispered. You're Elizabeth's brother? Jackson? His wife had mentioned a brother once or twice, someone she'd lost contact with years ago. James Jackson nodded. When Elizabeth married and changed her name, the trail went cold. I never knew she'd settled in Texas, never knew she'd had a daughter. His voice roughened. Never knew she'd died. The sound of footsteps interrupted them as Max returned, his posture alert but not aggressive. The dog looked expectantly at Thomas, then back toward the shed, his trained indication that he'd found Rachel and she was unharmed. I need to get my daughter, Thomas said firmly, pocketing the photograph. Jackson studied him for a long moment. You were good to her, to my sister? I loved her with everything I had, Thomas answered honestly. And I'd die before I let anything happen to Rachel. A distant explosion echoed from the direction of the mill, the second phase of the distraction. Jackson's radio crackled with alarmed voices, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on Thomas. Butcher won't give her up easy, he warned. He's got his own agenda, thinks I've gone soft. He drew his pistol again, checking the chamber before offering it to Thomas. You might need this. Thomas shook his head, patting Max's flank. We've got this. He signaled to the dog, who immediately moved toward the shed, Thomas following closely behind with Frank and Dr. Chin trailing at a safer distance. What happened next unfolded with the chaotic speed of combat. Max circled to the back of the shed as Thomas approached the front, drawing the attention of the guard. As the man raised his weapon, Max crashed through a rear window, creating the diversion Thomas needed to disarm the sentry with practiced efficiency. Inside, Butcher had just enough time to register the commotion before Max was on him, the shepherd's training evident in how he pinned the larger man without causing serious injury. Rachel, tied to a chair in the corner, let out a cry of relief at the sight of her father and Max. As Thomas freed her, checking quickly for injuries, Butcher managed to throw Max off, reaching for a knife strapped to his boot. Before he could use it, however, Jackson appeared in the doorway, his expression cold. "It's over," he told his lieutenant. "The girl leaves with her father." "You've lost your edge," Butcher snarled. "This was our chance to break the town, and you're throwing it away over some kid?" He lunged forward, the knife now aimed at Jackson rather than Thomas or Rachel. What happened next would be debated in Riverside Junction for years to come. Some would say it was Max who intervened, launching himself between Jackson and the knife. Others would insist it was Jackson himself who deflected the blade. What no one disputed was that in the ensuing struggle, both Max and Jackson were wounded, the shepherd taking a deep slash across his shoulder while Jackson suffered a puncture to his abdomen. As Deputy Wilson and her officers stormed the shed, they found a tableau frozen in time, Thomas shielding Rachel in one corner, Dr. Chin already moving to treat the wounded, and Butcher subdued on the floor beneath Frank Miller's surprisingly strong grip. Max, despite his injury, stood guard over them all, his focus unwavering even as blood seeped through his fur. "Uncle Jack?" Rachel's small voice broke the silence, her eyes fixed on Jackson as Dr. Chin worked to stop his bleeding. It was the first time she'd spoken since being taken, and the simple recognition in those two words changed everything. Dr. Chin worked frantically in the cramped confines of her clinic's surgical suite, her hands moving with practiced precision as she fought to stabilize Max. The German shepherd lay unconscious on the metal table, his normally alert form now terrifyingly still. The knife wound across his shoulder had been deeper than initially assessed, severing critical blood vessels and damaging muscle tissue. What made the injury particularly dangerous was not just its severity, but its location close to vital structures that, if compromised, they could end the dog's life or permanently disable him. "I need more light," she instructed her assistant, a veterinary student who had volunteered after hearing about the rescue. "And another unit of blood. He's still losing too much." The clinic, normally reserved for routine pet care, had transformed into an emergency trauma center. Dr. Chin had called in every favor, pulling in equipment and supplies from the county animal hospital. In the waiting room, Thomas sat with Rachel curled against his side, her small body finally succumbing to exhaustion after the ordeal. His mind kept replaying the moment when Max had lunged to intercept Butcher's knife, the same protective instinct that had saved Thomas's squad from ambushes in Afghanistan, now was potentially costing the dog his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. Max had survived 3 combat tours only to face death protecting a child in small-town Texas. Deputy Wilson entered quietly, her uniform still dusty from the operation at the water tower. "Any word?" she asked, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Rachel. Thomas shook his head. "Chin says the next few hours are critical." He lost a lot of blood. His voice caught, surprising him with its emotion. Max wasn't just a service animal or even a pet, he was family, the bridge that had connected Thomas to reality after Elizabeth's death, the companion who had helped Rachel find her voice again. "The town's securing the clinic," Wilson informed him. "James Washington and his crew are patrolling the perimeter. We've got volunteers watching every approach." She hesitated before adding, "There's another development. Jackson Chains, he's asking to see Rachel. His wound wasn't as serious, but the doctor wants to keep him for observation at the hospital." Thomas tensed. Despite the revelation of Jackson's relationship to Elizabeth, despite his eventual assistance in Rachel's rescue, Thomas wasn't ready to trust the man who had been terrorizing Riverside Junction for weeks. "Not yet," he said firmly. "Rachel's been through enough today." As if sensing her father's distress even in sleep, Rachel stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Max?" she asked immediately, the fear evident in her voice. "Dr. Chin is taking good care of him, sweetheart," Thomas assured her, wishing he felt as confident as he tried to sound. "He's very strong, like you." Rachel sat up, rubbing her eyes. "He knew Uncle Jack wouldn't hurt me," she said with the simple clarity of a child. "That's why he only bit Butcher." The observation gave Thomas pause. Max had indeed focused his aggression solely on Butcher during the confrontation, showing uncharacteristic restraint around Jackson. The dog's judgment, honed through years of distinguishing threats from allies in combat zones, had recognized something in Elizabeth's brother that Thomas was still struggling to accept: 500 words. The attack came just after midnight, when the town's vigilance had begun to waver under the weight of exhaustion. The remaining Iron Serpents, led by a bandaged but vengeful Butcher who had posted bail within hours of his arrest, descended on Riverside Junction with calculated fury. Their primary target wasn't Thomas or even the businesses that had defied them. It was the clinic where Max lay fighting for his life, and the symbol of resistance that had inspired the town's transformation from victims to defenders. The first warning came from James Washington's teenage son, who had been stationed on the roof of the auto shop with a pair of night vision binoculars. Multiple bikes approaching from the east, his voice crackled over the radio network. At least 12, moving fast with lights off. Thomas, who had been dozing in a chair beside Rachel in the clinic's waiting room, was instantly alert. He activated the town's emergency alert system, 3 short bursts on the volunteer fire department siren that signaled imminent threat. Throughout Riverside Junction, lights flickered on as the defensive network mobilized with a speed that would have impressed Thomas's former military commanders. Deputy Wilson arrived at the clinic minutes later, her expression grim. "They've split into 3 groups," she reported. "Main force is headed here, but they've got smaller units targeting the school and the community center, trying to divide our response." Thomas recognized the tactic from insurgent attacks in Afghanistan. "They think we'll prioritize the school, even though it's empty at night." "And they're right. I've already sent 4 deputies there because we can't take the chance," Wilson confirmed. "We're stretched thin, Thomas." Inside the surgical suite, Dr. Chin looked up at the sound of the siren, her hands steady despite her concern. Max's condition remained precarious. The transfusion had stabilized him, but he remained unconscious, his breathing shallow. Moving him would be dangerous, possibly fatal. She caught the eye of her assistant. "Whatever happens, we don't leave him," she said firmly, adjusting the IV drip that was delivering vital fluids and antibiotics to her patient. The defensive preparations Thomas had established throughout town were being tested in real time. Barricades appeared at strategic intersections, manned by determined citizens armed with spotlights and cameras rather than weapons. The documentation strategy that had proven effective during earlier confrontations was now paired with physical obstacles designed to funnel the attackers into predetermined approaches where they could be contained and identified. Thomas faced the most difficult decision of his life: stay with Rachel at the clinic or help coordinate the town's defense. The combat instincts that had kept him alive through 3 tours urged him to join the front lines, to apply his tactical expertise where it could save lives. But the father in him could not bear the thought of Rachel waking to find him gone, not after everything she had endured. It was Rachel herself who resolved his dilemma. "Daddy," she said quietly, "Max would help people if he could. That's what he's trained for." Her small face was solemn but resolute. "I'll stay with Dr. Chin. You go help our town." The simple courage in his daughter's words both broke Thomas's heart and filled it with fierce pride. He knelt before her, looking directly into eyes so like her mother's. "I'll be back soon," he promised. "Stay inside. Do exactly what Dr. Chin tells you." As Thomas joined the defense coordination at the clinic's front entrance, he found himself fighting not just external enemies but his own demons. The sounds of approaching motorcycles triggered flashbacks to roadside ambushes in Helmand Province. The responsibility of civilian lives weighed heavier than any combat command he'd held. Yet underneath the fear and memories lay something stronger: the determination to protect this community that had become his home, to ensure that Rachel would have a safe place to grow up, to honor Max's sacrifice by standing firm against those who would rule through intimidation. The Iron Serpent's assault on the clinic began with a small group of 3 bikes approaching from the front, while the main force circled to attack from the rear parking lot. Thomas recognized the strategy immediately. redirecting James Washington and 4 other volunteers to reinforce the back entrance seconds before Butcher and 8 riders roared into view. The clinic's newly installed security lights blazed to life, momentarily blinding the attackers and giving the defenders critical seconds to position themselves. What followed was not the one-sided intimidation the Iron Serpents had grown accustomed to, but an organized resistance that clearly caught them off guard. The town's communication network functioned seamlessly, with real-time updates allowing Thomas to shift resources precisely where they were needed. When 3 bikers attempted to break through a side window, they found Frank Miller and 2 hardware store employees waiting with fire extinguishers that temporarily blinded them. When Butcher himself led a charge at the clinic's rear door, the reinforced barricade held just long enough for Deputy Wilson to arrive with additional officers. Inside the clinic, Rachel sat beside Max's table, Dr. Chin working steadily despite the chaos outside. The shepherd's condition had deteriorated in the past hour, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. The monitors showed weakening vital signs that made the veterinarian's expression grow progressively more concerned. "He's fighting," Dr. Chin told Rachel gently, "but he's very tired." Rachel placed her small hand on Max's head, careful to avoid the bandages that covered his earlier injury. "He's the bravest dog in the world," she whispered. Then, to Dr. Chin's surprise, the child began to sing softly a lullaby with a gentle melody that seemed oddly familiar. It was the same song Elizabeth had often hummed while pregnant with Rachel, a family melody passed down from her own childhood. Outside, the battle for the clinic reached its climax as Butcher, frustrated by the unexpected resistance, resorted to more desperate measures. A makeshift firebomb crashed against the building's side wall, flames spreading quickly up the wooden exterior. The defensive line broke momentarily as volunteers rushed for fire extinguishers, creating the opening Butcher had been waiting for. He and 2 others forced their way through the clinic's back door, heading directly for the surgical suite. Thomas, alerted by the radio, raced through the smoke-filled corridors, his military training guiding him through the chaos. He reached the surgical suite door just as Butcher kicked it open, the biker's face contorted with rage and vengeance. Behind him, Rachel looked up from Max's side, her song interrupted by the violent intrusion. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Butcher advanced toward Rachel, a crowbar raised threateningly. Thomas lunged forward but knew he wouldn't reach his daughter in time. And then, in a moment that would become legend in Riverside Junction, Max's eyes snapped open. Despite his grave injuries, despite the veterinarian's certainty that he was too weak to move, the German shepherd rose to his feet on the metal table. His legs trembled with the effort, blood seeping through his bandages, but his focus was absolute as he positioned himself between Rachel and the threat, just as he had been trained to do. The sight of the wounded dog standing protectively over the small child, swaying but unbowed, caused even Butcher to hesitate. In that frozen moment of uncertainty, Thomas closed the distance, subduing the biker with a precision takedown. As Butcher fell, Max collapsed back onto the table, his final reserves of strength exhausted but his mission complete. Rachel was safe. The morning after the assault on the clinic dawned with an eerie quiet over Riverside Junction. The Iron Serpent's attack had been repelled, but at significant cost 3 townspeople hospitalized with injuries, the clinic's exterior badly damaged by fire, and Max still clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. As volunteers cleared debris and repaired broken windows throughout Main Street, an unexpected convoy of police vehicles approached from the county highway. Deputy Wilson stepped out to meet them, her expression changing from wariness to surprise as she recognized the lead car's occupants. Jackson Chain's Blackwood emerged from the passenger seat, his midsection heavily bandaged beneath a standard-issue hospital gown and a police jacket thrown over his shoulders. Behind him came Sheriff Roberts from the county seat and 2 state police officers. Most shocking of all was the small army of law enforcement vehicles that followed county deputies, state troopers, and even several unmarked federal cars. "What's going on?" Thomas asked as he joined Wilson on the clinic steps, having spent the night at Max's side while Rachel finally slept under Dr. Chin's watchful eye. Sheriff Roberts approached, his expression a mix of respect and mild embarrassment. "Mr. Connor, we owe you and this town an apology. It seems Mr. Blackwood here has been quite busy since his hospital admission last night." He gestured toward Jackson, who stood awkwardly between two officers. "He's provided comprehensive evidence against the Iron Serpent's operations across 3 states' names, locations, criminal activities dating back 5 years. In exchange, he's requested protection for you and your daughter." Jackson met Thomas's confused stare directly. "They were going to kill Rachel," he said flatly. "Butcher and the others. When they realized who she was to me, who I was to her, they saw it as the ultimate betrayal." He shifted uncomfortably, wincing at the pain from his wound. "I couldn't let that happen. Not to Elizabeth's daughter." Thomas studied his late wife's brother, seeing now the family resemblance he'd missed before, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intensity in the eyes. "Why the change of heart?" he asked, not yet ready to trust the man who had terrorized Riverside Junction for weeks. "When Rachel called me Uncle Jack at the water tower," Jackson replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I heard Lizzie in her voice, clear as day, like she was standing right there." He reached slowly into the police jacket's pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. "I've been searching for my sister since I was 18. By the time I found a lead that she'd married a Marine named Connor, the trail went cold. I never knew she'd died until I saw this." He handed the paper to Thomas, who unfolded it to find a crayon drawing Rachel's distinctive style, showing a family portrait. Elizabeth stood smiling between Thomas and Rachel, with Max at their feet. At the edge of the picture was a figure labeled Uncle Jack, looking in from outside the family circle. "She drew this while they had her at the water tower," Jackson explained. "Told me all about her mom, my Lizzie, and how she died last year. Said her mom used to tell her stories about her uncle who got lost." His voice cracked slightly. 15 years looking for my sister, only to find I'd missed her by months." Frank Miller's full confession came later that day in the town hall, where a community meeting had been hastily organized to address the night's events and the startling revelations about Jackson Blackwood. The old gas station owner stood before his neighbors, shoulders bent under the weight of his shame, and told the complete story that had led to his betrayal. "My son Bobby fell in with the Iron Serpent 6 years ago when he was working that trucking job out of Houston," Frank explained, his weathered hands gripping the podium for support. "Got caught running drugs in their supply chain. When he tried to get out, they framed him for a robbery he didn't commit. He's been serving 5 years, with parole coming up next month." The old man's voice wavered. "James Jackson, he showed up at the gas station that first day with photos of Bobby in prison. Said his associates could make sure my boy never made it to his parole hearing unless I helped them." Thomas watched the community's reaction, seeing the initial anger and betrayal on their faces gradually soften as Frank described the impossible choice he'd faced. Martha Simmons, who had been among Thomas's harshest critics, shook her head in dismay. "Why didn't you come to us, Frank? We've known you for 40 years. "Because I was ashamed," Frank admitted. "Ashamed that my boy had gotten mixed up with these people, ashamed that I wasn't strong enough to stand up to them." He looked directly at Thomas. "And then I saw how you and Rachel and that dog of yours stood your ground, and I realized what real courage looks like." The debate that followed was heated, with some calling for Frank to face charges for his role in Rachel's kidnapping. Others argued for compassion, pointing out that Frank had ultimately tried to warn Thomas and had helped in the rescue operation. Throughout the discussion, Rachel sat quietly beside Thomas, watching the adults with her solemn, observant eyes. When the argument reached its peak, she slipped from her chair and walked to the front of the room, climbing the steps to the podium where Frank still stood. The room fell silent as the 7-year-old reached for Frank's gnarled hand, taking it in her small one without hesitation. No words were necessary. The simple gesture of forgiveness from the person most harmed by his actions spoke volumes. Adults who had been arguing moments before found themselves blinking back tears at the child's uncomplicated compassion. Thomas watched his daughter with a complex mix of pride and humility. Throughout his military career, he had seen the world in clear divisions, allies and enemies, right and wrong, good guys and bad. Riverside Junction had forced him to confront a more complicated reality, where good people made terrible choices for understandable reasons, and supposed villains could reveal unexpected depths of humanity. Max's surgery lasted nearly 6 hours, with Dr. Chin working alongside a veterinary specialist who had driven in from San Antonio at Jackson's request. The specialist, it turned out, had extensive experience with military working dogs and had been flown by helicopter to the nearest airport, with his fees paid in advance by the same man who had put Max's life in danger in the first place. "It's touch and go," Dr. Chin told Thomas afterward, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. "The blood loss was severe, and there's muscle damage that may never fully heal. But he's stable for now." She managed a tired smile. "He's quite extraordinary, you know. Most dogs would have succumbed to those injuries hours ago. He's fighting hard." In the following days, as Max slowly stabilized, an unexpected dynamic emerged in the recovery room. Jackson, released into Deputy Wilson's custody pending his cooperation with federal authorities, began spending hours sitting quietly beside the German Shepherd's bed. At first, Thomas was wary of these visits, but Dr. Chin reported that Max's vital signs actually improved during Jackson's presence. "He talks to Max about Elizabeth," Rachel explained to her confused father. "About when they were little. Max likes the stories." Gradually, Thomas found himself sharing the vigil with his late wife's brother, and the two men rarely speaking directly to each other but united in their concern for the dog who had saved Rachel. During one of these silent watches, Jackson finally broke the awkward quiet. "Your dog," he said carefully, "he's got the same look my unit's bomb dog had in Fallujah." At focus, he met Thomas's surprised expression. "Marines, 2nd Battalion, 2003 to 2007. Got out, couldn't adjust, found the iron serpents when I was looking for something that made sense." He stroked Max's ear gently. "Never thought I'd end up on the wrong side of another veteran." The revelation struck Thomas like a physical blow that the man he'd been fighting had walked the same battlefields, carried the same burdens. Max, perhaps sensing the tension, stirred slightly and pressed his muzzle against Jackson's hand in a gesture of acceptance that seemed almost deliberate. "He's a better judge of character than I am," Thomas acknowledged quietly. Across Riverside Junction, similar conversations were taking place as the town wrestled with questions of justice, forgiveness, and rehabilitation. The easy narrative of villains and heroes had been shattered, replaced by the more difficult recognition that redemption was possible even for those who had caused harm. The three broken souls at the center of it all, Thomas, Jackson, and Max, became an unlikely bridge between divergent perspectives, from their shared love for Rachel offering a path toward healing that extended beyond their immediate circle to encompass the entire community. 6 months after the confrontation at the water tower, Riverside Junction had transformed in ways that few could have predicted. The abandoned Iron Serpents compound had been purchased by the town through a community fundraising effort and was being converted into a multi-purpose center. On a bright spring morning, Thomas Connor stood at the edge of the construction site watching as volunteers installed windows in what would soon become the building's main hall. Max sat beside him, the German Shepherd's posture still proud despite the slight favoring of his left shoulder, a permanent reminder of the knife wound that had nearly taken his life. "Looking good, isn't it?" Frank Miller approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The old gas station owner had become one of the project's most dedicated volunteers, spending every free hour at the site. His son Bobby, recently released on parole, worked alongside him, finding acceptance in a community that had chosen reconciliation over resentment. "But better than I imagined," Thomas admitted, accepting the coffee. "Dr. Chin says they'll have the therapy rooms ready by next month." The community center had evolved beyond its original conception to include a dedicated space for Thomas's new program, a support group for veterans with PTSD, with a special focus on animal-assisted therapy. Max, once trained to detect explosives and protect soldiers, now helped former service members navigate civilian life, his calm presence a bridge between war's chaos and peace's uncertainties. The program had already attracted attention from neighboring counties, with veterans driving hours to participate in sessions where they found understanding without judgment. Rachel's role in the center's development had been surprisingly central. Now, speaking regularly, though still quiet by nature, she had become a fixture at planning meetings, offering crayon illustrations of what each room might look like. Her vision of a space where hurt people and hurt animals can heal each other had resonated deeply with the committee, shaping the center's ultimate purpose. In the months since her kidnapping, Rachel had blossomed in unexpected ways. The trauma, rather than silencing her further, had somehow unlocked her voice. Dr. Chin theorized that facing her greatest fear, separation from her father and Max, had shown Rachel she could survive even the unthinkable. Whatever the reason, she now read aloud to other children at the library's weekly story hour, always with Max lying protectively at her feet, his alert eyes sweeping the room in a habit he would never fully abandon. Behind the community center's development lay another surprising partnership. Jackson Blackwood, serving a reduced sentence in the minimum security wing of the county jail, had provided not only detailed testimony against the Iron Serpent's national network, but also his considerable mechanical expertise. Through a rehabilitation program championed by Deputy Wilson, now Sheriff Wilson, following her predecessor retirement, Jackson taught motorcycle repair and maintenance to at-risk youth during supervised sessions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had once threatened Riverside Junction now helped shape its future, his path to redemption running parallel to the town's recovery. The grand opening of the Riverside Junction Community Center coincided with the first anniversary of what locals now simply called the Water Tower Day. A podium had been set up in front of the renovated building, its fresh paint gleaming in the summer sunshine. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly as people from across the county gathered for the ceremony. Rachel, dressed in a blue sundress that matched her eyes, fidgeted nervously next to Thomas in the front row. Max lay at her feet, his service vest freshly brushed for the occasion, a splash of gray now visible around his muzzle. Sheriff Wilson approached the podium, her uniform pressed and formal. 1 year ago, she began, Riverside Junction faced a threat that could have torn us apart. Instead, it brought us together in ways none of us could have anticipated. She gestured to the building behind her. This center stands as a testament not just to our resilience, but to our capacity for growth and forgiveness. The sheriff acknowledged each group that had contributed to the center's creation, from James Washington's construction crew to Mrs. Rodriguez's fundraising committee, from the county's law enforcement to the rehabilitation specialists who had designed the veterans program. But perhaps our greatest debt, she continued, is to those who showed us that protection sometimes comes from unexpected sources, and that healing requires both strength and vulnerability. Frank Miller was called forward to make a surprise announcement. The old veteran stood straight despite his years, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Miller's Fuel Stop has been serving this town for 43 years, he said proudly. "Today I'm signing over the property to Riverside Junction to be developed as a park adjoining this community center." He smiled at the murmurs of surprise. "My son and I have talked it over. It's time for something new to grow where something old has stood." The gesture represented more than just a land donation. It was Frank's final act of atonement, transforming the site of his betrayal into a space for community healing. Thomas watched Bobby Miller place a supportive hand on his father's shoulder, the younger man's face reflecting both pride and peace. Second chances, Thomas had come to understand, were precious gifts that benefited both the receiver and the giver. When Rachel was called to speak, a hush fell over the crowd. Thomas felt his heart swell with pride as his daughter approached the podium, a small step stool already in place so she could reach the microphone. Max rose automatically to follow her, positioning himself beside the step stool in the protective stance that had become second nature. "Thank you for coming," Rachel began, her voice soft but steady. "My dad says I should tell you what I think about our new building, but I want to tell you about Max instead." She glanced down at the German Shepherd, who looked up at her with complete attention. "Max is brave even when he's scared. He's strong even when he's hurt. He protects people even when they don't know they need protecting." Her small hand rested on the dog's head. I think our town is like Max now. We look out for each other. We're stronger than we look, and we're not afraid anymore. 1 year to the day after the confrontation at Miller's fuel stop, 4 figures made their way through Riverside Junction's small cemetery. Thomas walked beside Rachel, who carried a bouquet of wildflowers. Max followed slightly behind, his pace dignified despite his lingering limp. A few steps back, Jackson Blackwood moved cautiously, still adjusting to his weekend furlough privileges after 9 months of incarceration. They stopped at a simple headstone bearing Elizabeth Connor's name, the dates of her birth and death, and the inscription, "Beloved wife, mother, and sister finally found." Rachel carefully arranged the flowers at the base of the stone, then stepped back to stand between her father and uncle. "Mom would be happy we're all here together," she said with the straightforward certainty of a child. Neither man contradicted her, though both felt the complex emotions that accompanied this unlikely family reunion. Jackson had earned his furlough privileges through exemplary behavior and continued cooperation with authorities dismantling the Iron Serpents network. His testimony had led to dozens of arrests across 3 states, effectively ending the gang's operations. The price had been high. He would serve at least 3 more years, but the former biker leader seemed at peace with the consequences of his choices. "Elizabeth always believed people could change," Thomas said quietly as they turned to leave the cemetery. "Even when I didn't." Jackson nodded, his eyes on Rachel walking ahead with Max. "She was right about a lot of things," he replied. "Wish I'd found her sooner." Their route back took them through the heart of Riverside Junction, yet past storefronts that now displayed emergency contact information and safety protocols developed during the crisis. What had begun as defensive measures had evolved into community infrastructure, a network of communication and support that extended beyond security to address broader needs. The hardware store now hosted monthly preparation workshops. The library had developed a children's program teaching safety through storytelling. Dr. Chen's clinic offered free first aid training every second Saturday. Most striking was the change in how people moved through town, not with the fearful vigilance of the previous year, but with confident awareness. Neighbors greeted each other by name. Strangers were welcomed rather than suspected. The iron fence that had once surrounded the elementary school playground had been replaced with a lower, more decorative barrier that allowed clear sightlines while still defining the space. As they approached Thomas's home, now landscaped with a proper fence for Max to patrol, Rachel ran ahead to grab her latest book, eager to continue their tradition of reading aloud in the evening. The adults followed more slowly, an unspoken understanding between them about the unlikely journey that had brought them together. That night, as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, Rachel sat on the porch swing between Thomas and Jackson, reading her story with growing confidence. Max lay at their feet, his graying muzzle resting on his paws, but his eyes still alert, still watching over his family with unwavering dedication. The German Shepherd had survived war zones and knife wounds, had protected the vulnerable and inspired the strong. Now, in the quiet of a Texas evening, he guarded something even more precious, a broken family finding its way back to wholeness, and a community that had discovered its own capacity for courage. And they all lived happily ever after, Rachel concluded, closing her book with satisfaction. "Is that how the story ends?" Jackson asked, still awkward in his role as newly discovered uncle. Rachel looked up at him with Elizabeth's eyes, wisdom beyond her years shining in their depths. "Not yet," she said simply. "We're still writing it." As night fell over Riverside Junction, Max lifted his head at a distant sound, ears pricking forward briefly before settling back into relaxed vigilance. All was well with his pack, and that was all that mattered to a dog who had finally found his forever mission, not in war, but in peace, not in combat, but in healing, not in detecting danger, but in nurturing love. In the twilight of our years, we often reflect on what truly matters. Outlaw bikers mock the wrong little girl reminds us that family comes in many forms, sometimes through blood, sometimes through circumstances, and sometimes with 4 legs and a faithful heart. The story of Rachel, Thomas, and Max shows us that our greatest strengths often emerge from our deepest wounds. As we age, we understand that the battles worth fighting aren't always against obvious enemies, but against fear, isolation, and the temptation to turn away from one another. The German shepherd who stood guard despite his injuries mirrors our own journey. We may bear scars, we may move a little slower, but our capacity to protect what we love never diminishes. This tale speaks to the wisdom that comes with years. True security isn't found in locked doors, but in open hearts, and communities that stand together cannot be broken. Like Max, may we remain watchful, loyal, and brave, knowing that even in our winter years, we still have vital missions to fulfill. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.